Hello again, fellow Mystery Files. Today I am back with a review of an Ellery Queen novel. This time it is Double Double, the final true entry in the Wrightsville arc of Ellery's life. And this was an interesting one for me because I did not remember this book all too well. I knew the basic premise of it, but I did not remember who the culprit was or what was happening. I did get it about halfway through. It came back to me, but I went into this more or less blindly. And I saved this for October because I thought there was like a supernatural sort of theme to it, and there isn't. So it is out of season. I did intend this month to be a little bit more spookier here, but oh well. And if you have not read this book yet, I would say the Christie novel most similar to it is Murder is Easy. So if you're a fan of that, you might enjoy this. And as a reminder, I will have a spoiler free summary up until the point of the murder reveal, so you are free to back out at that point if you don't want to be spoiled. Spoilers will be fair game after that. And before I begin, make sure you join in the Discord server if you haven't already. There are active conversations going on there about all things mystery and other things as well. And just again, so YouTube has been being weird with comments. Like I see there are comments, and then I can't access those comments. So if you've commented and I haven't responded or acknowledged your comment, I do see it, but I can't actually interact with them. I don't know what YouTube is doing, so I've been trying to, but again, so it's not my fault this is happening. But the link in the Discord in the link in the description for the Discord server, and make sure you like and subscribe and share the video to keep up to date with the channel. Double Double begins with a mail call. Ellery receives an envelope with no return address, but he immediately knows it comes from Wrightsville, that mysterious New England town that Ellery is repeatedly drawn to. By the way, this is the final Wrightsville novel, or I should say the final true Wrightsville novel. The town does make other appearances, but this is the last one fully set there. And Ellery, of course, reminisces about the town, even Miss Sally's tea shop and her pineapple marshmallow nut mousse. But inside the envelope are some newspaper clippings. The first is dated February 1st, about 2 months prior to the current date, and it is an obituary slash news article about the death of Luke McCabe, 74, of heart failure. Luke McCabe was the town hermit and pauper, and he lived in this dilapidated house, and he never really appeared in public. The second article is a revelation that Luke McCabe was actually incredibly rich because he was a secret partner in the Wrightsville Dye Company alongside John Spencer Hart, and McCabe left his vast wealth to his doctor, Sebastian Dodd. We're also told Dr. Willoughby, who is a recurring character from Wrightsville, has died since the last novel. And the reason McCabe left his physician the fortune is because the doctor continued to treat him when he thought McCabe couldn't pay, which imagine that in the US nonetheless, and also because Dr. Dodd spent his whole life treating the poor. We're also told McCabe's servant, Mr. Harry Toyfell, got nothing, and he is just fine with that because he's religious and he hates money and would just rather take care of plants. The final article is a passage stating that John Hart, that owner of the Wrightsville dye plant, committed suicide, apparently after Dr. Dodd inquired about the company's finances. And yeah, Hart was a gambler and he borrowed against the company and embezzled, but the dye works are still solvent. All of these articles are written by Malvina Prentice, and Ellery wonders who could have sent them and thinks maybe that local town gossip, the town crier Emmy Dupre. This wouldn't be the first time she would be accused of sending anonymous newspaper clippings through the mail. But to Ellery, it doesn't make sense why she would because she's not very subtle. And also, he's wondering why in general. There are deaths, yes, but there aren't. It doesn't seem to be any real crime committed here, and there's no suggestion that anything sinister has been happening, so Ellery just pushes this out of his mind. A few days later, Ella receives another envelope. This one has an article dated April 3rd, so only a few days prior, and this one is about the death of local town drunk Tom Anderson, whose hat and coat were found near a cliff. It's clear some kind of tussle or fight happened with Tom, likely falling over the cliff into the impenetrable swamp below. At least that's what Chief Inspector Dakin, whom we know well from previous novels, thinks, but it's not known whom Todd was fighting with. A few more days later, Ellery answers the door and sees a young woman. She is Rima Anderson, daughter of Tom, and she has come to seek Ellery's help. She thinks her father was murdered because he recently gave up drinking and wasn't like the combatant type. She denies sending Ellery the newspaper clippings, and she doesn't really have anything to do with Wrightsville. As she explains, her father Tom was sort of the black sheep of a wealthy family from Wisconsin, but he moved east and became a college professor. His wife, he married his wife against his family's wishes, and then they had Rima. Rima is named after Rima the Jungle Girl, who is a real life comic strip character. I had to look this up because I did not know who this was, but Rima the Jungle Girl is like a female version of Tarzan. Ellery compares her in novel to Mowgli as well. And Rima actually predates Tarzan. She is an older character than Tarzan. But anyway, Rima Anderson and her parents basically lived in seclusion in the woods outside Wrightsville as hippies, living off the land until their mother died when Rima was 10. Tom became an alcoholic at that point and lost his job as a professor and then his job teaching English at Wrightsville High. Tom and Rima lived in this shack in the woods, living off the land, and it's like a few dollars Tom's family sent. And they lived like that for years until very recently. Rima never really went into Wrightsville, but Tom did on occasion, mostly to get drunk. But within the last month, Tom suddenly gave up alcohol and with no explanation given. Rima thinks Henry Toyfell, that servant of Mr. McCabe's, or Nick Javert, the local town thief, might have something to do with it because those were her father's closest friends. Ellery agrees to go to Wrightsville because he's a little smitten with Rima, as Ellery tends to be, and of course Rima butters him up real good by saying her father thought the world of him, and if Rima were ever in trouble, she should go seek him because he helped other people in Wrightsville before. But first, Ellery pays for Rima to have a makeover because she's dirty and unfashionable because she lives in the woods. This scene is slightly better than the makeover scene from the moving finger, emphasis on the word slightly. But in general, Rima is presented just very strangely. Like Ellery describes her both as a child and a woman, but also like neither a child or a woman. And she is more attractive, like when she's all dolled up. But Ellery just finds her off-putting, mainly because she's very childlike and naive. Like she doesn't understand people. She has like this very like childlike personality. She's lived a sheltered life and had her father to protect her, and she clearly has daddy issues. So Ellery keeps her away from the inspector, his father, and they stay in separate hotels in Wrightsville. But the night he arrives in Wrightsville, Ellery goes to see Chief Inspector Dakin, who has this odd feeling something up with Tom Anderson's disappearance. Remember, this is still a missing persons case. No body has been found, but Dakin, like Rima, also thinks this is murder. But Dakin doesn't see any connection between Tom Anderson and Luke McCabe and John Hart, so Ellery doesn't push it. The next day, Ellery and Rima visit Dr. Dodd, since he seems to be at the center of everything, and when they arrive at his office, they meet Dr. Ken Winship, who is Dr. Dodd's protege. Dr. Winship's father was apparently a very minor character we met in Calamity Town. I did not remember him. But Dr. Winship is young and he is immediately attracted to Rima, which pleases Ellery because Ellery's basically been looking to dump Rima on someone. And no, Dr. Winship would be perfect. He's poetic, he's attractive, and would couple nicely with Rima. And also, Dr. Winship also lost his romantic interest in his secretary because they got into a fight over her like terrible filing. She's apparently no Miss Lemon, but she's also engaged to someone else anyway. But Dr. Dodd arrives and is eager to see Ellery. And he explains that Tom Anderson came to him concerned about Rima and how not only he has nothing to leave her if he died, that he didn't raise her right at all. And of course, Rima objects to this, but it's just so painfully obvious it's true. Rima has no skills, no social ability, she's naive, and Tom Anderson also wanted to get sober. So Dr. Dodd made him a deal that if Tom remained sober for a week, he would give him $5,000. And if he lasted 6 months, Dr. Dodd would open an annuity for Rima. Dr. Dodd, remember, has all that money from Luke McCabe, though it's still held in probate. And Dodd says Tom Anderson made it the 1 week sober, but the 6 months had not yet passed, and Tom disappeared, so that deal is off. Dodd sent Tom to collect the money from his lawyer, one Otis Holderfield. So Ellery and Rima go to see Holderfield, but not before Ellery secures Rima a job at the doctor's office, much to the delight of Dr. Winship. But Otis Holderfield is not a good lawyer. He's very obviously schemy and sleazy, but he was Luke McCabe's lawyer, and Dr. Jaw just kept him on. But Ellery wonders why Holderfield was chosen in the first place. I mean, the lawyer's just not helpful at all. And even in the meeting, he stops so he can be measured for a new suit. And Ellery makes a few comments about just how gaudy the office is. Holderfield's clearly someone new into money and doesn't know how to spend it properly. And the tailor also here, by the way, is David Waldo. More on him later. But Holderfield says that he did give Tom Anderson the money, even though he didn't want to. But Tom returned to the office and asked Holderfield to keep that money in a safe. Now, the envelope Tom returned was the same envelope Holderfield gave him, but it was taped shut, so Holderfield didn't actually see the contents that were returned to him, but he knows it's money because, he knows money. But then Holderfield said he gave that envelope to Nick Jacquard, Tom's friend, the town thief, because that's what Tom said to do once he died. And this is extremely shocking. Not only does it seem very strange Tom would give the money to Nick Jacquard, a thief, and not his daughter, but Ellery is just very angry Holderfield gave the money away, considering Tom Anderson is only missing. He's not legally dead. Ellery and Rima track down Nick Jacquard, who is again unwilling to help, but he claims there was nothing but letters in the envelope. There was no money in it. Ellery doesn't believe that, but to Jacquard's credit, he doesn't seem like he came into money. Ellery and Rima's next stop is to see Malvina Prentice at the Wrightsville Record. She not only wrote those articles, but she now actually owns the newspaper after Frank Lloyd from Calamity Town and the Van Horns from 10 Days Wonder are no longer in charge for obvious reasons. We get a lot of Ellery reminiscing here and how he doesn't recognize anyone there anymore. And Malvina Prentice is, she's certainly a character. There's a lot of sexism thrown her way. Ellery constantly calls her the lady publisher instead of just the publisher. And she's also very domineering. She's turning the Record into a tabloid, but she is insulted when Ellery asks her if she knows anything more about those deaths than what she published, as if she would have passed up the opportunity to have more sensational content. And Malvina also has this male assistant named Francis O'Bannon, and he is very meek, completely emasculated by Malvina. He's whipped almost literally at one point, and Ellery says he is, quote, under the lash. And Malvina Prentice comes off as, almost a caricature of the girl boss that we think of today, but this is 1950. She keeps offering Ellery money for his story and for him to work there, but he just hates her. And Rima is shocked someone like her exists because, again, she has no experience dealing with people. And Rima, by this point, has sort of lost interest in dressing nice and staying at the hotel. She just wants to go back to her life in the woods. And she takes Ellery not to her shack, but to a secret, secluded place in the woods she calls, I'm sure I'm not going to pronounce this correctly, Yataioa, which I did not know, but apparently that's the mountainous area where Rima the Jungle Girl lives. Ellery understood the reference, I did not. But while there, they play with forest animals, go swimming in a freezing lake. Ellery was apparently too modest to change in front of her and had to hide behind a tree to put his swim trunks on. And they have a picnic where Ellery lays out some thoughts. I mean, to him, Dr. Dodd is the only thing connecting McCabe Hart and Tom Anderson's death/disappearance. So Ellery discusses this hypothetical that Dodd is behind the deaths. What if Dodd knew he was Luke McCabe's heir? He could have poisoned McCabe and covered it up. And if McCabe had told him that John Hart was embezzling, and knowing the kind of man John Hart was, Dodd could have intentionally asked to see the financial reports, knowing Hart would commit suicide rather than face the music. Ellery admits that's hard to believe, but it's not impossible. And he also suggests that Tom Anderson then could have blackmailed Dodd over this since he was friends with Harry Toyfell, McCabe's servant, who likely knew things. And Rima just refuses to consider any of this because she hero worships her father and she just cannot contemplate anything negative about him. But Ellery pushes this. And again, there's no evidence that $5,000 Dr. Dodd gave Tom was really for him going sober. We only have Dr. Dodd's word for that. And Ellery's hands are tied because Rima, doesn't feel comfortable snooping around Dr. Dodd because she's in love with Dr. Winship. So Ellery says, like, if she's not going to help, there's nothing he can do, and he returns back to New York. And his absence lasts literally less than one paragraph before he's back in Wrightsville a week later. Rima called. She had been looking around for things, but she didn't find anything interesting about Dodd. However, Dodd is basically on the verge of a nervous breakdown. He's very fidgety. He's clearly in fear of something, but Dr. Winship can't get him to take a vacation because they have too many patients and there's a diphtheria outbreak. But more interestingly, Rima says the housekeeper told her that every morning Dr. Dodd gets up and immediately goes into a room in the attic. No one is allowed in there, and Dodd keeps it locked from everyone, and Ellery naturally wants to get in there. One night, Ellery, Rima, and the two doctors go out, and when they return to Dodd's house/practice, it's the same building, they hear a noise and realize a burglar has broken in. Dr. Dodd takes out his gun, but he's too nervous, so Dr. Winship takes it from him. They confront the burglar, who turns out to be, of course, Nick Jacquard, and go to tie him up, but Jacquard fights back and storms Dr. Winship, causing the doctor to shoot him dead. Dr. Winship feels bad about this, but Ellery claims it was fate and inevitable that Jacquard will wind up dead soon enough, and Dr. Winship just happened to be the means by which it happened. Dakin is called in, and he's pretty mad no one told him that Tom Anderson left the $5,000 to Jacquard, which Dakin actually finds this money at Jacquard's house unspent. Ellery sits back and thinks again. Rima is pretty angry that Ellery is still accusing Dr. Dodd, but Ellery knows Rima is just blinded by her feelings for Dr. Winship, which is in turn affecting her opinion of Dr. Dodd, just as how she was blinded by her father. Ellery is still convinced Dodd is the connecting factor. He just has to be. He speculates that maybe Tom Anderson had left a clue for Jacquard in the money envelope, which would explain why he didn't leave the money to Rima. And what Jacquard was looking for when he was shot was that incriminating evidence. But Rima still isn't having this and said there's no way Dr. Dodd is connected to the murder of a rich man, a poor man, and a thief. And this clicks something in Ellery's head. He goes to explain this to the two doctors, but Dr. Winship is pretty indignant here and doesn't want to hear it, whereas Dr. Dodd is just totally out of it at this point. But Ellery explains that there is a pattern in these deaths. Luke McCabe was a rich man, John Hart was a poor man, Tom Anderson was considered a beggar, and Nick Jacquard was the town thief. Rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief. The famous counting rhyme, which in completion is rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, lawyer, Indian chief. But Dr. Winship takes offense to this, mostly because he technically killed Nick Jacquard, but Ellery's mind is focused on fate and how Wrightsville has this odd and mysterious tendency, and that Dr. Winship was only the instrument who did it, and that he didn't really do it. It was the town and fate playing a factor. Ellery is unable to get the keys away from Dr. Dodd, so he resorts to climbing around on the roof to see into the attic room. He can because there's a tear in the curtain, but the room, doesn't have anything interesting in it. It's barren except for a desk and some decks of cards, but Ellery watches as Dodd enters the room shaking and cuts the deck of cards and reveals the ace of spades. Dodd panics more and cuts another deck of cards and picks the ace of spades again. Ace of spades again. Of course, the death card, but that's it, and it's very weird. Ellery notices Toyfell was watching him spy on Dodd. Ellery then asks Dakin to help him commit a crime by making a key based on a mold Ellery secured, and Dakin pretty much agrees with this despite, getting nothing in return. The inquest into Jacquard's death exonerates Dr. Winship, as expected, with the DA really just being pretty nasty to Jacquard's widow and basically saying she's better off with him dead and Dodd will provide for his family. And Ellery finally gets into that attic room, but again, there's nothing there. In the desk drawer are just random assortments of cheap items. Later, Dodd becomes very frazzled when a bird finds its way into the room. A bird in the house is said to be an omen of death. And, that's exactly what happens. One night, Dodd goes out for a house call and dies in what I will describe as a car accident. It's actually far more gruesome than that, but the cousins mostly spare us the gory details of what actually happened. If this were a Nile Marsh, she would not have. But Dakin rules Dodd's death an accident, but Ellery very clearly thinks this is murder, and Malvina Prentice and her assistant O'Bannon notice that Ellery thinks otherwise. But Ellery and Malvina just keep staring at the back of Dodd's head, or they would if Dr. Dodd had a back of his head. But there really wasn't a house call, and there didn't seem to be any indication there was like anything but an accident. Now, Dr. Dodd left a will. In fact, it was a new will written only about the week prior, really a few days. As Ellery says, Dodd had a phobia of death, which explains his nerves. But the will doesn't reveal anything, juicy. The servants received a small amount of money. Dr. Winship got the house, but mostly everything went to this fund to build the new hospital, so there wasn't a lot helpful there. And this is a bit disappointing to Dr. Winship because he says he hoped there would be more money so he could marry Rima. Although Ellery notes that Mr. Holderfield, the lawyer, is now probably screwed out of money because Dodd was his only big client and Holderfield was spending money like crazy. Ellery also suspects maybe Holderfield will die next because lawyer is next listed in the poem: rich man, poor man, beggar man, thief, doctor, then lawyer. Dr. Winship didn't get anything except the house, which is paid for by the estate, and he has to live there for 5 years. And this sort of prompts a marriage proposal between him and Rima because of appearances. They are living together without Dodd now, and the gossip will spread through Wrightsville. Also in the equation here is Harry Twyfell, whom Ken fires. Twyfell, once again, received nothing from his rich employer. This is the third time this has happened to him, but Dr. Winship gets rid of him basically because he's a jinx. Twyfell worked for McCabe, Hart, and Dodd when they died, and also was friends with Tom Anderson and Nick Jacquard. Ellery tries to warn Holderfield that he could die soon, but the lawyer is just not hearing it. He thinks he's impervious because of all the money he has now, and he's found another wealthy client, so, he has no concerns. Dr. Winship and Rima get married, and while they're away on their one-day honeymoon, Ellery goes to get drunk at the pub. Already drunk is Francis O'Bannon, who can't remember Ellery's name, and he's not really Francis O'Bannon. Well, he is Francis O'Bannon, but he has a cousin of the same name, and the cousin is the one with the fancy Harvard degree, and he basically stole that to work for Malvina Prentice. And O'Bannon spills all kinds of beans about his boss, including that she's been married 3 times, and he was attracted to her, but she's also like really terrible and all that. But Ellery, just at a loss, tells both O'Bannon and Malvina about the rich man poor man motif, which they publish the next day. Also, the next day, Otis Holderfield dies. He fell out of a window like some Vladimir Putin adversary. Naturally, Dakin and everyone else thinks this was just another accident, and there's no suggestion of foul play. Only Malvina Prentice is siding with Ellery, and now Ellery decides to ask about Indian chiefs because Indian chief is the final person in the poem, but there are none in Wrightsville. But then Ellery remembers an alternate final line of merchant chief and suspects the Waldo brothers, these twin tailors whom Holderfield has been dealing with. Holderfield, by the way, also hired Twyfell and died in debt. 11 days later, a fire erupts at the Waldo Brothers store. They also live above the store. David Waldo escapes, but Jonathan Waldo dies in the fire. Horrific death he experienced. We're told he was burned to a crisp. And I was actually surprised just how little page time this fire received because it was like the one thing I remembered about this book, and it really got very little page time. But Dakin still insists this was an accident, at one point even saying the fire started via spontaneous combustion. The store, by the way, is across the street from Dodd's, now Winship's house in practice. Dakin says the brothers both took sleeping medication prescribed by Dodd for insomnia, and Dakin thinks Ellery is wrong about the poem because Jonathan wasn't the merchant chief of the twins, David was. The business and the house were in David's name, not Jonathan's. Ellery pays another visit to O'Bannon. Ellery requested he looked into the origins of the poem, and Ellery realizes there are actually multiple versions. There's the one that ends in Indian chief, which we know is not in play. There's the current assumption ending in merchant chief, but there's another one that ends in merchant, comma, chief. Two separate people. And the only chief in Wrightsville, according to Ellery and everyone else, is Police Chief Dakin, which this is definitely an error because we had just met the fire chief in the previous chapter. But anyway, David Waldo has gone missing, and Dakin tracks him down to a town about 2 hours away. Ellery goes out there and makes sure to take with him a certain birthday present his father once gave him. If you've read other Queen novels, you might know what this is. It makes a few appearances, but this is also where I end the spoiler-free section, so back out now if you don't want to be spoiled. You've been warned. David Waldo is just completely out of it. He's traumatized, he's exhausted, he's delusional. He doesn't really have any connections with most of the other victims. He was a patient of Dr. Dodd, and the last time we saw the doctor alive was about 3 days before Dodd died, when Holderfield called the Waldo brothers and asked them to come over and witness Dodd's will. Ellery asked what day this was, and at first he said it was Monday, but then he said it was Tuesday, and then he eventually comes to the conclusion that it was both Monday and Tuesday, which is strange. Ellery drives back to Wrightsville and falls into what's very clearly a roadblock trap where the driver in the car behind him shoots him twice, but Ellery survives relatively unscathed because that birthday gift is a bulletproof vest that previously saved Ellery's life. It does so once again. He does get shot in the arm because it's sleeveless. This is, again, pre-Kevlar days, so the bulletproof vest is just a sheet of metal. And then Ellery realizes what's happening. Dakin isn't the only chief in town. Ellery is chief to someone. Someone called him chief, and that person is Rima. Ellery and Dakin go to the house and arrest Rima. They claim the tire marks that chased Ellery's car. Ellery drives a Buick, by the way, in this novel, not his Duesenberg, but tire tracks match Ken Winship's vehicle. Dr. Winship is furious about this and says Rima is innocent. She was home all night with him. Also, this sort of implied that Rima doesn't know how to drive. Like, she lives in the woods and in seclusion. Like, I don't think she knows how to drive, but again, that's not mentioned. And then he confesses to the murders, and this is exactly what Ellery wanted, that Dr. Winship was so in love with Rima that he would confess if Rima were in any danger. And like I said at the beginning of this video, I did not remember anything about this solution, and it did click back to me when Dr. Winship shot Nick Jacquard that it was him. I didn't remember anything else about this book except that it had a lot of deaths and there was a fire. And why did Dr. Winship do this? Well, this gets very convoluted. Ellery explains all to Malvina Prentice and Frances O'Bannon. Luke McCabe and John Hart died exactly how they appeared to. McCabe's death was natural, and Hart shot himself rather than be exposed as an embezzler. There is a clue here in that they died in February, 2 months before the novel began, and the novel takes place from April to June. Dr. Dodd was the heir to McCabe's fortune, and Dr. Winship wanted that money. Dodd had no family and no friends, and Winship assumed he would be Dodd's heir. But he didn't want to wait to get that money, and also Dodd was extremely generous and just giving money away to everyone. There might not be anything left to inherit by the time Dodd died a natural death. But there was another problem. Dr. Dodd had a fear of death, and people with a fear of death don't do things like make wills because that's considered a jinx. So Dodd did not have a will, and Winship would not inherit if his boss died intestate. He recognized McCabe was a rich man and Hart a poor man, and used the counting rhyme to strike fear into Dodd and convince him that his death was imminent. If this sounds a little contrived to you, you are not alone. I would agree. Winship sent those articles to Ellery, knowing Ellery's reputation in Wrightsville. He knew he could lure Ellery to town, and Ellery would pick up on the rhyming pattern. He did not count on Rima getting Ellery involved, but that didn't really matter. Winship murdered Anderson as the beggar, and then tricked Nick Jacquard into breaking into the house where Winship shot him. This was not an accident. Winship planned this all along. With the death of a beggar and a thief, Dodd was convinced he was next. Ellery even suggests Winship somehow manipulated the drawing of the Ace of Spades and the burn in the house. But anyway, Dodd was convinced and made a will with Otis Holderfield. And once he did that, he was doomed. Winship assumed he would be the natural heir as Dodd's closest associate. However, he didn't know that Dodd had rewrote his will the following day. Winship killed Dodd. How, Ellery does not explain, but then it was revealed Dodd left only the house rent-free to Winship, and the money went to the children's hospital. Winship delivered this throwaway line to Rima saying that he hoped to have provided more for her, implying that he was expecting something bigger. And that was that. Winship intended to murder no more, but since this is Wrightsville, fate intervened and completed the counting rhyme. Winship murdered Holderfield because Holderfield was blackmailing Winship. The lawyer knew the contents of the original will and knew Dodd had changed his heir from Dr. Winship to the hospital. How Winship killed Holderfield is not explained. Winship continued to spiral and murdered Jonathan Waldo because the brothers had witnessed the will and may have seen its contents. He then tried to kill Ellery for reasons also not really explained, but the novel ends with Ellery finding Rima a job with a professor of nature sciences and a lot of loose ends just not really tied up at all. Now for praise, and I have to be honest here, I really just like don't have a lot to say in either praise or criticism. I find Double Double to just be extremely average. I find very little like worthy of explicit praise or criticism outside of like the usual comments. And I rank this number 21 of 33 Ellery Queen novels, and that's probably about right. Now, I did find the plot largely intriguing. It's a bit more of like a psychological thriller than a whodunit, and I do think the setup is, again, largely intriguing. Why is Ellery being sent to these articles? Is there something more sinister going on? I think the cluing is actually very good, even though it is pretty sparse. McCabe and Hart's death occurring 2 months before the others is a big sign that those are different. I like the clue about Winship saying he hoped to provide more for Rima. That is an excellent clue, so perfectly placed. And there's very good like continuity with previous novels that I always appreciate. I like most Queen novels. This one is like sufficiently humorous and sarcastic. There are some great like one-liners, including one from Rima saying she can't eat her friends, referring to like woodland creatures, and Ellery just being like extremely shy and like doesn't want to like change in front of her, even though she's like totally free and everything. Overall, this is a fine Queen novel. It's average. It's a little generic. If you're a fan, it's worth the read. I'm not sure like if someone just getting into Ellery Queen or who maybe only likes the very best would be very much into this one. I have to be honest, I wasn't really much into this one either. But again, it's fine. And I do have some criticism, but again, it's not like really overwhelming. I think Rima is a very strange character who is both sexualized and infantilized. Not at the same time, thank goodness, but she's very much like, I would say, Miranda from Halloween Party, although at least she's an adult. It's just very strange how Ellery is like attracted to her initially. And it's not just Rima, but like most of the characters in this are just not standouts, including our murderer, Dr. Winship, and our main victim, Dr. Dodd. Malvina Prentice is like a highly flawed character. I wouldn't say any of the characters are duds necessarily, but they're just barely enough there for everyone to like squeak out of dud territory. I think most damning is Winship's plot being just extremely convoluted and contrived. And while this is like par for the course for Ellery Queen, the cousins always make it work and they always make it make sense and that you can believe that this person did that. And I did not feel like they made it work here at all. We're not even given like explanations on how he killed Dodd or Otis Holderfield or Jonathan Waldo. Otis Holderfield is especially problematic because we're told it was impossible for anyone to have entered the building. So it's like, why set that up and give us no explanation? Ellery literally says, "Oh, you know how he did it." It's like, no, no, we don't. And there are just a lot of like loose ends not explained. Like even Tom Anderson is sort of left hanging. And the ending is just like odd with Ellery. Like at one point, suspecting Dr. Winship may have had PTSD from the war and that was responsible. It's just like a very strange thing to throw in there, especially given like the murderer is a fox that I covered earlier this year being very defensive of people with PTSD. And also, like, I've seen this suggested that this book is somehow like a thinly veiled like allegory for the Red Scare that's coming because the people being murdered are somewhat different. I would disagree with that. I don't think there's a lot of like Red Scare stuff going on here. Maybe that's just my interpretation, but I have to be honest, I didn't really get that. But if that is there, again, that's just sort of like a cheap trick that we've seen like a lot before, and it's not very creative or anything. Now, for the characters, starting with Ellery, this was a mixed bag for Ellery. I thought, as mentioned, there were a lot of good continuity, which I enjoyed, but I also thought there was like missed opportunities as well. This is the novel immediately after 10 Days Wonder and Cat of Many Tales, which were two extremely traumatic cases for Ellery. And at the end of the latter, he just began like seeing a psychiatrist, but there's no mention of that. There's no progression of storyline from that. And I didn't find a lot of good character moments for him. It was a lot of like repeating the same sort of events we've seen a lot by this time, even within the novel. And his relationship with Rima was just weird. We see a lot of this where there'll be like an attractive young woman who serves as Ellery's companion. He's attracted to her, but like she's not really that interested in him, and she likes some other guy. And that is more or less what we have here. And it's just like very trite and repetitive. And this one is pretty bad because like Rima is not a good character, and we don't have any of Ellery's usual friends here. I didn't find his investigation to be all that interesting. He doesn't like do anything particularly memorable. It's not like all bad, but again, this is not one of his best appearances. Our murderer is Dr. Ken Winship, who I thought was a terrible character. It's a bad sign when I cannot remember who the murderer was from previous reads. I always remember that, or most of the times at least, but I didn't hear. And I think the problem for me is that he has just no character moments, and what personality he does have doesn't really match his alleged motivation in crime. Like, I cannot believe he is so greedy he'd murder all of these people in really brutal ways to get the money. It doesn't really jive for me. This is like the work of a truly depraved individual, and I did not feel Dr. Winship met that. It's very hard to see, and he just sort of like gives up so easily at the end. Like, this should have been a much better character. And we have many victims, but I want to talk about a few. We have Tom Anderson, local drunk and beggar, and we never meet him. And I think the most fascinating thing about him is Rima's worship of him and how great he was. And by all other accounts, he wasn't that great. And Ellery does pick up on this. I was a little confused as to how Tom knew Ellery. I mean, I don't remember him in other Wrightsville novels. Maybe he was there, but I don't remember. And I think he could have injected some life in this novel if we actually had met him, even for a brief period of time. Our main victim is Dr. Dodd, and I thought he was fine, like certainly one of the better characters in the novel. His extreme fear of death is something notable. It does provide some character moments for him, and I liked his death. It was brought about because of his generosity and because of his character. Because he is so generous, it means Dr. Winship has to kill him sooner, and because he is so kind, he will make a house call in the middle of the night, significantly increasing his chances of being killed. And it's unclear if he realized Winship is responsible. Ellery thinks it's possible because of the will change, but I think it's just because he cared more about the hospital. It's up to your interpretation. Again, that's one of the things. It's a loose end that's not tied up, but I didn't particularly mind this loose end. And the final victim we're talking about is Otis Holderfield's corrupt lawyer. I found him to be a lot of fun. The very like sleazy lawyer who doesn't really care about anything but money, even interrupting meetings to get measured for new suits, which I thought was funny. And he was doomed to be killed, honestly. And he is someone I could see as a blackmailer, just like a totally clueless and unaware individual. And he was a fun minor villain. Again, I wish he maybe played a larger part because our main villain was kind of nothing. And for some regular characters, we have Rima, who I didn't really care for. I mean, she did have some fun moments with her, like living in the woods and befriending the animals, like she's Snow White and all that. It's just a bit weird. Like, we never actually visit her shack she talks so much about, but she did have some good moments. Like, I think her naivete about her father and her inability to read people in general made for interesting character moments, but I do think her flaws overshadow any positives. She just has a weird depiction of being sexualized until I realized she's just like childlike, and it's just odd. And I also wonder like how on earth she managed to navigate to New York and find Ellery. Like, how did she get through Grand Central Station? She lived her whole life sheltered in the woods. So there are inconsistencies in her character, and I also feel like when she starts working for Winship, she sort of like falls out of the story quite a bit. We see a lot less of her, and I also never really bought that she was the murderer behind the whole thing, as we're like supposed to be tricked into believing at the end. It just didn't work. Harry Toyfell is a character with a lot of missed potential. He is present when most of the deaths happen. He is connected to them, but it's all just a coincidence, which seems like a bit of a letdown, honestly. I wish something like creative was going on here, but there wasn't. He's the town philosopher who doesn't like money. And I think there was a lot to be done with him that just wasn't. And as the town philosopher, he should have at least like very like hint at the solution, like give a drop a clue that he knows what's going on. Something to like old Myrtle from Dead Man's Folly, I think would have been appropriate here. Malvina Prentice is someone who, again, I think could have been a better character, but she really was just a stereotype of the girl boss. And what's frustrating here is that there is a lot of setup to her backstory and how she had all these prior husbands and a life before she bought the newspaper, and just absolutely nothing was done with that. Another missed opportunity, and it's frustrating to set these things up and then just not use them. And I think Malvina like should have been in the novel more. Like she seemed like a very formidable adversary to Ellery. She keeps him on his toes, and she has like some modicum of respect for her. But like she just makes a couple of appearances, and again doesn't really like do all that much. And largely the same thing for Francis O'Bannon, who again has a similar setup to Malvina, with him having forged his diploma and his love hate relationship with his employer. But again, it goes nowhere really, and nothing is done with it. It just feels like the cousins needed to like pad out these characters with something. And it's a shame because I think O'Bannon could have been a better character, but him and Malvina seem to be there just because the Wrightsville record always gets featured when Ellery's in Wrightsville, and they wanted to do that again. But he does have the fun scene where he gets drunk and can't remember Ellery's name, and he calls them everything that rhymes with Queen and quite a few things that don't, and winds up confessing his love for Malvina in front of her. But story wise, there could have been more there, and there should have been more there, and we don't even get a resolution to him and Malvina's story. And that is it for this video. Let me know in the comments what you think about Double Double. Again, this is, again, not one of my favorite Queen novels, not a particularly strong novel, but again, it's just fine. And again, there actually is an adaptation of this from the Further Adventures of Ellery Queen from 1958, where George Nader plays Ellery Queen. I honestly have not seen this episode, so I cannot speak to its quality, but the synopsis did not sound too promising. It sounds like they made a lot of changes to it, although maybe those changes are for the better. But in general, I did find like the Further Adventures of Ellery Queen to, again, not be the better of the Ellery Queen series that are out there. So, I mean, take what you will from that. But next week, again, continuing in October, a little spookiness, we have our subgenre deep dive of the month, and that will be the ever torturous psychological thrillers. So stay tuned for that. Until next time, Mystery Files.